Welcome everyone to Half History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder Historian, and when we last left off with Hancock, George Meade had just passed away, and Hancock moved his family back east in order to take command of Meade's post. While Hancock and his family was in transit to Philadelphia to the headquarters of the Military Division of the Atlantic, William Tecumseh Sherman changed the location of the headquarters to New York City. George Meade had been permitted to keep his headquarters in Philadelphia because it was his hometown, but since the old general had passed away, there was no need to keep it there, so the Hancocks had to change course. Winfield took command of the division on December 16, 1872. The division incorporated New England, the Mid-Atlantic states, and the Great Lakes region. The Great Lakes were commanded from Detroit by Meade's and now Hancock's subordinate, Philip St. George Cooke, the father-in-law of the famed Cavalier Jeb Stuart. The rest of the division fell under the direct supervision of the division commander. Hancock had been adept at army paperwork since before the war, and this was more of that very same thing, and he was good at it. This monotonous job, although important, produced a lackluster life, as opposed to the thrill of battle experienced in the war. However, the general did get to spend more time with his family. Unfortunately, in March 1875, at the age of 18, Ada, the Hancock's daughter, passed away. Winfield was grieved at this, especially since he had been so close to his daughter in the recent years. In 1876, the presidential election grabbed the attention of Hancock, who had supporters all over the country, putting his name forward as a possible candidate. For countless elections all over the country, Republicans waved what was called the bloody shirt. In short, that meant that they used the fact that they fought to preserve the Union, and the Democratic side supported secession and the destruction of the country as a way to gain votes, on the basis of being loyal to the United States. When Civil War veteran Rutherford B. Hayes was put up by the Republicans, the bloody shirt was waved, and the only way for Democrats to get them to put the shirt away was to nominate a Union Civil War veteran as a candidate. Therefore, at the convention, Hancock's name was thrown into the ring, but Samuel Tilden of New York had secured the nomination long before the convention took place. On the second ballot, Tilden was declared the candidate. The election of 1876 was controversial, to put it lightly, but through political maneuverings and manipulation on both sides, Hayes was made president-elect. Calls were made to march on Washington and overthrow the election. Democrats even named Hancock as the man who could do it, but those that put forward that idea did not know Winfield Scott Hancock. The general himself was dedicated to the belief that the military should not interfere in civil life. Indeed, if something of that sort had happened, one can bet that Hancock would have been the one leading the charge against the insurrectionists. However, none of that materialized, and Hancock continued as division commander. Between 1876 and 1877, much of the South and the Gulf came under the command of Hancock, but with Hayes' end in Reconstruction, the job of the Army changed through the eastern half of the country. The nation was embroiled in a hot labor dispute by 1877. The United States experienced a depression in 1873. Most workers were simply happy to keep their job, but 4 years later, as the country was rebounding, the railroad companies had begun a rate war against one another. This led to companies slashing the pay of their workers to keep in competition with other railroads. However, although they cut the pay of workers, they still gave the customary 10% dividends to their stockholders. This infuriated the workers, and in 1877, we see the Great Railway Strike. Much of the focus was on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, where strikebreakers were called in to replace those workers who refused to run the trains. However, in Martinsburg, West Virginia, the situation was a little different. The citizenry was behind the striking railroad workers. The police force was too small to control the protests, and even though they arrested some of the workers, a large crowd extricated them from the jail. Eventually, the large crowd blocked any train from moving, and around 1,200 freight cars were blocking the tracks at Martinsburg. The strike spread from West Virginia to Maryland and then all over the country, but some of the most violent instances occurred in Pennsylvania, especially Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, and towns between the two major cities. In Pittsburgh, militia had fired 2 volleys into a crowd and killed many. The angry mob trapped them in a railway yard, and troops only escaped by shooting their way out, losing some of their own. Hancock went to work traveling first to Baltimore and then to Philadelphia, spreading his troops all over the states of Pennsylvania and Maryland. The presence of regular troops quieted the rioters, but there was still underlying tension. Hancock commented that the workers and their families were in bad situations and half-starved. However, for the moment, the strikes had been taken care of. The next crisis emerged in the coal district of Pennsylvania. Troops were sent to that part of the state, but Hancock became concerned because the political infighting between the president and Congress had prevented the soldiers from getting paid. Winfield ordered his troops to be encamped at a reasonable distance from the strikers to prevent them from joining forces against the corporations or the government under a common cause. The troops stayed at their posts until October 30th and were finally recalled. Hancock did not like the idea of using the army in disputes between labor and corporations. He felt that that was a wrong way to use the army, and stated as much when he wrote to the adjutant general that the regular army should not be made a police force for the state. Despite his own distaste for the job he was doing, both politicians and citizens respected Hancock for performing his duties and making sure his soldiers did not act like the militia who caused more disturbances in the strikes. The general's biographer said it best when he wrote that to emerge from such turmoil as the guardian of public order clearly established Hancock as one of the most beloved of America's military leaders.